Junie saw too. She started running toward her father, running as hard as she could until one of the policemen grabbed hold and held her back. "This isn't the time to see your dad, honey," he said. "You'd best go inside with your brother." Nate stared at the figure slumped between the officers, moving toward them. He recognized the work boots and the old blue jeans, the mop of sandy hair. The part that was new was the blood pouring down his face and the terrible, crumpled expression. It looked as if the weight of the whole world were pressing down on his shoulders, as if something had broken inside him that could not be fixed. He must have put his hands to his face at some point because they were bloody too, and on his work pants were splotches of deep red. "What's going on?" Nate called out, his voice as choked as if a pair of hands clutched his throat. The officer was holding him by the shoulders. His mom was there too, putting her arms around him, or trying to. "It's going to be okay," she said, but she didn't sound like she believed it. "I need to see my dad," Nate yelled, louder this time. From one of the cruisers, Nate could make out the crackling sound of the dispatcher on the radio, and one of the policemen answering in the clipped tone Nate had heard on Dragnet, where whatever terrible thing was going on that week on the show was boiled down to a few flat syllables. "Victim of a gunshot wound over at the Chance farm," the policeman said into the microphone. "Guy's been missing since this morning, but the dogs finally located him, wandering the back 40. From where the bullet entered his head, you'd never think he could have survived." "I have to see him," Nate yelled, more desperate now. "Daddy!" It was Junie this time. They were putting her father in the back of an ambulance that had pulled up, and she was wriggling and crying, trying to get free of the police officer's grasp. "Bullet must have missed his brain," the officer said into the transmitter. "That's a miracle of it. Unclear exactly what happened. The guy isn't making any sense." For a long minute, Nate didn't move. He heard one of the officers calling again to get the kids in the house. The barking of the bloodhounds, the police car idling out front, Aunt Sal's car pulling onto the gravel drive next to them. He could hear the faint, muffled weeping of Junie, who seemed to have gotten the impression the blood came from the dogs biting their dad. He heard the cows, overdue to be milked, lowing in the barn, and Rufus muttering, "See what I mean? Crazy." From his mother, no sound. Nate smelled sweat and realized it was his own. He could feel the thick arms of the police officer, wrapping around his waist and lifting him off the ground as he bucked to free himself. "Get your hands off me," he yelled. "Just leave me alone." "Easy, honey," Aunt Sal this time, her cool hand pressing hard on his jacket, like she was easing an ornery bull back into the stall. "Let go of me. I want my dad." He flung his whole body down, scrabbling his fingers in the frozen ground. Hands pulled at him, Aunt Sal and two of the policemen. He could see the feet of the dogs as they pawed against the sides of the police van, hear the scratchy sound of the dispatcher on the radio, and, quieter, the voice of his father as he was eased into the ambulance. Not words, just a low moaning. He tried crawling on his belly. He had to get to his dad, but the hands kept him back. The door slammed and the ambulance pulled away. One of the officers lifted him up. "Easy, kid. You don't need to be seeing this." "That's my dad inside. I have to see my dad." "Your dad's in no shape, son. We're bringing him to the hospital. Your mother's coming along to answer some questions. You'd best let the adults take charge and go on in the house." Nate kept kicking, so hard one of his shoes came off. He watched the boot sail past the tire swing their father had put up for them and land in a mud-encrusted snowdrift along the gravel. "Come on now, honey," Aunt Sal was saying. "Let's you and me and Junie go in the house and fix ourselves some hot chocolate." As he watched the ambulance disappear down the driveway, Nate took a last look at the figure in the back, his father. By the time he reached the back door, he was quiet. He even knew to take off his one remaining boot, along with the wet sock so he wouldn't track mud onto the linoleum. Chapter 2. Even Junie knew that their family had been having hard times. Papa, their mom's father, whose adjacent ranch was 4 times the size of their own small dairy and hay operation, was always criticizing his son-in-law for not being a good enough farmer. But to Nate, it seemed like his dad had just had a bunch of bad luck. Milk virus taking 5 of their best heifers 2 years back, followed by a drought that wiped out half their feed crop. Then came the new regulations from the Dairy Association that required them to buy expensive refrigeration equipment if they wanted to keep selling their cream. For as long as Nate could remember, they'd kept the cream jugs chilled in the wooden box his dad had rigged up in the creek that ran behind the barn. Now the county health department said that wasn't good enough, and the Meadow Gold truck, which used to come by once a week to buy the thick, rich Jersey cream, hardly ever stopped at Chance's farm. Last year, the Mercury needed a new radiator, only there was no money to buy one. This year it was the washing machine that gave out. Nate didn't know the particulars, but late at night he'd heard his parents talking in the kitchen, and where once there'd been laughter and his dad's deep bass voice, now it was arguing, and something worse, a sound from his mother of disappointment and defeat. "It's not Dad's fault we're having troubles," Nate told his grandfather the day he'd come by the house a couple of summers back to find Nate's mom bent over the books, crying. "Where's Carl at this time?" Papa asked. When his mom explained about taking Junie to the rodeo in town, Papa had just shaken his head. Papa never said much, but Nate knew his grandfather disapproved of his dad. It was Papa who'd given them their land, and in his opinion, his son-in-law hadn't done a very good job with it. Even with the money their mom made teaching piano, they were just barely getting by. But Dad had said all of that was going to change. Back in the spring, he'd borrowed a lot of money from an old friend of Papa's, Sam Carter, who'd struck it big in cattle. With the cash, he'd bought a new baler and 80 additional acres for haying, and for a while there he had seemed almost happy. The plan was that they'd hay the alfalfa to sell. Dad had never worked so hard as he did on that grain crop, digging the new irrigation ditches, fertilizing, and reseeding the alfalfa. "This is the one that'll turn things around for us, Helen," he told Nate's mother. Nights when he came in from the field, he'd set a single stalk of alfalfa on the table so they could study the progress of their crop. "Pretty soon now the kernels will start plumping up," he told them. "And so will my wallet, honey." If things went well, he said, they could pay Sam Carter back within the year. From then on, it would all be gravy. Nate could get a bike his own size instead of the old red Pee-wee lowrider he had since he was 7, and Junie could get a regular horse she could actually ride instead of the crazy pony they had now, and maybe a saddle to boot. They'd fix the suspension on the Mercury station wagon, and the 4 keys on his mother's piano that had stopped sounding, making odd little gaps in the music when she played. Maybe they'd even get a telescope. "Come harvest on, even your father will have to say I did something right," Dad told Mom. The two of them standing on the edge of the field one late June evening, watching the sun set over the crazy mountains, and the hawks circling above their plump and golden crop of grain. The last week in July that year, a strange, heavy stillness came over the farm. "High-pressure area," his father said. "Looks to me like a summer storm brewing. One last good rain, just what we need before harvest." All day the sky was the flat, dull gray of a battleship, but then it suddenly grew dark as mud. The wind grew still, and a strange, eerie smell seemed to hang over them. Even the cows in the field behind the barn sensed something was coming, milling around like restless school children during a fire drill. The weather vane didn't rotate, even half an inch. Then it happened. A freak storm with hailstones big as baseballs pounding down so hard that one dented the Mercury. Theirs was the only place in the whole county that was hit. 15 minutes later it was over, but the damage had been done. Their entire precious crop was pummeled, while just 10 acres over, Ben Landry's crop of wheat and barley stood untouched. Dad had stood upright as a pitchfork, surveying the damage. But that night, Nate had gotten up and seen him through the doorway, shoulders hunched, filling a glass with whiskey. "We're finished, Helen," he'd said to Nate's mom the next morning. "Sam Carter will end up with the deed to our land. Your father will never let me live this down." When it was over, they went out to survey the damage. He and Rufus, and even his mom, bending over the stalks and studying them. The buds were knocked off the plants and lying on the ground, mostly. Only bare stems and a few battered leaves were left. There was no choice but to sell what they could for a fraction of what they'd been counting on. Christmas, there had still been presents under the tree, but just one for each of them. By New Year's, Nate's father was spending most of his days sitting in the big chair in the kitchen, staring out the window. Seeing him that way, a sinking feeling would come over Nate. Something awful was happening, and nothing he could do would make it stop. Chapter 3. After the police cruisers and the ambulance pulled away, Nate figured Aunt Sal would tell him and Junie what had happened. But as she set the hot chocolate down in front of them, she didn't say anything about police cars, or barking dogs, or their father and all that blood. "Go watch TV," she told Junie. "Isn't it time for your favorite show?" Then Aunt Sal picked up